This is it. Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover hidden truths, and explore why they matter. I'm Bacon Bears, and today we are talking about episode 4, the final chapter. After dissecting the evidence, the trial, and the explosive moments that shaped this case, one question remains. Did justice prevail, or was this one of the biggest failures in legal history? Let's unravel the aftermath, the lasting impact, and what this case truly left behind. They open the episode with Mark Fuhrman essentially asking if he did or didn't plant the evidence. And once again, they start talking about the DNA, and Kim Goldman, Ron Goldman's sister, comes on and says, even if I have questions, how do you excuse the DNA? Bill Thompson comes on, and he's a DNA consultant, and he talks about a two-way transfer of blood from OJ to the victims and blood from victims to OJ. Also, just a side note, I assume it was like this in every other episode, but I only caught it until now. Why does Bill Thompson's background look like a post-apocalyptic office building? What is going on here? If you guys are listening to this on podcast, he is just sitting in a room and there's like overturned chairs and file papers everywhere, and it just looks like a bomb went off in this office. It's such a weird background. The question becomes, how do you explain that evidence away? It was more about you getting the jury to believe that you had the capability in the technology to do this. And as far as DNA evidence, they had OJ's DNA at the crime scene, they had Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown's and OJ Simpson's blood in the Bronco, including a spot where there's a mixture of all three of them. There were socks that were found at the bottom of OJ's bed on the floor, and one of the socks had OJ's blood on it, and the other sock had Nicole's blood on it. And as far as 2025 goes, this all looks like it should be an open and shut case. And Kim Goldman brings up a really good point. They could explain why he would have hair fibers and blood from Nicole anywhere around OJ Simpson, but there should be zero reason why anything of Ronald should be around OJ. They had no connection to each other. So remember in a previous episode where we talked about the fact that the media had set up camp in front of the crime scene in front of Nicole Brown's house? Well, there was a ton of media there, and what the defense team did was they went through all of those tapes to watch how the DNA and the evidence was collected. And then in the courtroom, they just absolutely picked that apart. And there were a lot of ways that the police fumbled the evidence in this case. But I also understand why they did what they did at the time of these things happening. They bring up that there's a blanket that they had put over Nicole Simpson's body. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely not, because you're disrupting a crime scene. But there are 100 media personnel outside of her house taking videos and pictures of her nearly decapitated body on her own sidewalk. However, the defense's goal was one of two things. Either the LAPD was completely incompetent, or they did this on purpose so that they could frame OJ. They provided pictures of where evidence was moved and how evidence could have been contaminated, and built the theory around the fact that it could have been planted. One of the examples was when they were cross-examining a man named Dennis Fung. They had asked him, would you ever collect evidence by using your bare hands? And he said, no, I wouldn't. And I have to tell you, I've never been on the stand in this situation, but if a lawyer says, are you sure about that? And I'm a Gemini, should have been a lawyer. But let me tell you, when a lawyer utters that phrase, you have just answered a question that they already had the answer to. And as a Gemini, a lot of times I'll never ask you a question I don't have the answer to. So be careful. But anyways, Dennis Fung was, in fact, not sure of that, because they have a clip of him with no gloves on transferring evidence, which is a big no-no. And by him admitting that he was wrong, that gives the defense a huge advantage when it comes to building a case of cross-contamination. The thing you have to remember in a courtroom setting in a criminal case, right? The prosecution and the defense have two very specific jobs. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, which means that they have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There cannot be one slight shred of doubt. You have to know with 1,000% of your soul that this person is guilty of what they did. And the job of the defense is not necessarily to prove that their client is innocent. They just need to poke holes in the prosecution's case, because if there is any shred of doubt, then you can't charge them with being guilty of this crime. Now, for this case, OJ was getting charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for the use of a knife and there being multiple victims. And this could have made him eligible for the death penalty, but they didn't seek it at the time. Instead, they pursued life in prison without the possibility of parole. And the responsibility of the jury is to evaluate the evidence, consider the burden of proof. Did the prosecution prove beyond reasonable doubt that Simpson committed premeditated murder? They were supposed to remain impartial, which means only to consider the facts and evidence, not personal opinions, emotions, or outside influences. They had to follow the legal instructions on how to interpret the law regarding the first-degree murder and special circumstances and reasonable doubt. And under California law, first-degree murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought committed willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation. Did the prosecution bring forth their case? Yes. Did the defense also poke hole after hole after hole in the prosecution's case? Also, yes. The question is there any other possible explanation that anybody other than O.J. Simpson could have committed this crime? And my thoughts are no. As far as planting evidence, the defense shows 2 different pictures of a gate. The second one had a blood spot in a location on top of the gate railing, but the first one did not. And granted, I have to tell you that the picture quality is wildly different. Now, the defense wants you to believe that somebody tampered with the evidence and put it there intentionally. Is that possible? Sure. Is it also possible that somebody unknowingly transferred it there because they weren't handling DNA evidence the way that they should have been? Also, yes. And that's the problem. Absolutely. Then they bring up EDTA. EDTA is a chemical commonly found in laboratory test tubes, and it prevents blood from clotting or coagulating. But it also can be found in foods, cleaning products, and even the environment in small amounts. Now, the defense claimed that the blood stains found at the crime scene contained unnaturally high levels of EDTA, which they argued meant the blood could have been taken from a preserved sample, like the vial of Simpson's blood collected by the police, and then planted at the scene. To support this, the defense brought in an expert who testified that EDTA levels in certain blood samples were too high to be naturally occurring. And this fueled their argument that the LAPD had mishandled or even fabricated evidence. However, the prosecution countered this by arguing that the tests used to detect EDTA were not reliable enough to prove contamination. They also point out that EDTA exists in trace amounts in the environment, meaning its presence in blood samples didn't automatically prove tampering. But in the end, this argument adds to reasonable doubt. The jury at this time may not have fully understood the complex science. In 1994, the tests used to detect EDTA in forensic blood samples were not very reliable, especially by today's standards. During the O.J. Simpson trial, the FBI used gas chromatography mass spectrometry. I said that so good. And they use that to test for EDTA in the blood evidence. However, this method was not originally designed to detect EDTA in blood, which makes the results questionable. The biggest issue was that the FBI had never used this test on blood before, so there was no baseline to compare whether these levels that they found were normal or suspicious. And then, of course, there's scientific disagreement with experts on both sides arguing whether the FBI's methods could be trusted. And because the science wasn't advanced enough to provide a clear answer, it left the room for reasonable doubt in the trial. By 2025, forensic testing has dramatically improved with methods like high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, providing far more accurate and reliable EDTA detection. If the same blood samples were tested today, modern technology would likely give a much clearer answer, but I digress. Now, remember in a previous episode where I said OJ gave a blood sample when he was taken in for questioning? Well, it turns out Detective Van Adder was just carrying that around because he was just going to hand deliver it to the criminalist. And where is the criminalist? At Rockingham. And what is Rockingham? OJ's house. And what is OJ's house? A goddamn crime scene. This is not good. One of the strangest things about this moment in the trial was after the defense team is done ripping Dennis Fung to absolute shreds on cross-examination, essentially calling him incompetent. He gets up, walks off the stand, walks over to OJ, and shakes their fucking hands. What? Christopher Darden says to him it was like a surrender. But to me, it was almost like validation. Like, hey guys, did I do a good job? Mr. Fung, which side are you on? You just walk out of the court. You just leave. Just leave. The documentary goes on to talk about the murder weapon and it never being found. Everyone thinks OJ discarded it at the airport, including me, and then they get into the gloves. Now, remember, one was found at Nicole's house and one was found at OJ's house. And Christopher Darden decides that he's going to have OJ put on the gloves. So first and foremost, they have OJ wearing latex gloves. But then, apparently, OJ knew that this was coming because Mike Gilbert says, if you're worried about them fitting, then just don't take your arthritis medicine. What? And OJ allegedly says to Mike, if I don't take my meds, my knuckles will swell. You don't say. And OJ, being the paid actor that he is, plays the role of his life, and it backfires on Chris Darden. And even though they had proof of OJ on TV wearing the same exact isotoner gloves, it doesn't matter in the end. And when you might think that this is at its worst, it's not, because then they get into the Fuhrman tapes again, but we get them in detail. The defense finds out about Laura Hart McKinney and Mark Fuhrman, and they work together because McKinney was writing a screenplay about women in law enforcement, and to make her story realistic, she interviewed police officers, including Mark Fuhrman, because she wanted to learn about their experiences. So between 1985 and 1994, she records conversations with Fuhrman. He talked about police work, race, and violence. And Fuhrman speaks about the tough militaristic mindset of law enforcement. And he describes how officers are expected to assert dominance in certain situations. He suggested that some officers believed using force and intimidation was necessary to control crime. The tapes contained racially charged language. Fuhrman discussed racial tensions in policing. He made biased statements about certain communities and suggested that race influenced police interactions, including how officers handled interrogations, arrests, and suspects who resisted. He talked about police using force and implied that some officers had a no-nonsense attitude toward people that they believed were guilty. And as these recordings were meant for research, they later become a huge problem in the O.J. Simpson trial, because the defense was going to use them to prove that Mark Fuhrman was a racist and could not be trusted as a witness. So Judge Ito has a hearing outside of the presence of the jury to listen to the tapes. And even though the jury wasn't present, the cameras were still rolling, and they played tape after tape. And I have to tell you, it's disgusting. Christopher Darden said that these tapes confirm to the Black community that the LAPD not only employed racists, but they also embraced racism. And they show Mark Fuhrman listening to his own words, and he said that he was reiterating stories that he had heard. And when asked if they were true, he didn't really give an answer. When they asked if he is a racist, he says, I can't combat what is done is done. And it makes me question in 2025, have you made any changes? Do I think people could change their minds? Sure. But I don't feel like we got an answer out of anything. Did you used to be racist and now you're not? Now you're not? Are you still racist? Just answer the question. What we want to know in 2025 is if at one point you really felt that way, what have you done to better yourself? What makes any of your words credible now? Marcia Clark gets up on the stand and says, we can't have these tapes because that's to smear Mark Fuhrman, to get the jury to look away from the evidence and only focus on Mark Fuhrman. That argument might have been valid. However, Johnny Cochran comes back and says Mark Fuhrman committed perjury, which was true. He lied on the stand. However, after all of that and all the hours of tapes brought before the court, Judge Ito only allows the jury to hear 2 of the entries that were put into evidence, and Johnny Cochran is pissed. He holds a press conference addressing it, and he uses the phrase, quote, and the cover-up continues, which to me implies that Ito was in on it. And the public starts to tear Judge Ito apart. And now they're putting the LAPD on trial. And Fred Goldman, Ron Goldman's dad, goes in front of the press and he is irate. This man has lost his son, and he says Johnny Cochran states that racism is the most important thing that any of us should listen to in this court. This wasn't about Ron or Nicole anymore, but we have to remember that two things can be true. Racism can absolutely be a part of this case, and OJ can absolutely be a murderer. But this case became something so far on the other end of what it should have been about, which is Nicole Brown, a mother, a sister, a daughter, and Ron Goldman, a son, a brother, a friend. But now this becomes the trial of Mark Fuhrman, and he's called back on the stand. And then when he gets up on the stand, he pleads the fifth on every question they ask him, including, did you ever plant or manufacture evidence? And Mark said that his private attorney had told him what to do because Marcia Clark wouldn't return his phone calls. And now you have a detective on the stand who's been proven as a racist, who's been proven as a liar, and now who won't give you an answer on whether or not he planted or manufactured evidence. Do I believe that he did? No, I don't. Even if he did put the glove there, let's say he did, absolutely. He planted the glove, he manufactured it, whatever. There is so much other evidence to prove that OJ was absolutely a part of this crime. Do I think Mark Fuhrman is a racist and should have been employed as a police officer? No, I don't. But that's not what this trial was about. And they were able to make such a show out of Mark and this point that almost all of the other evidence was just thrown out the window. Is Johnny Cochran an unbelievable defense attorney? Absolutely. In this trial, in this case, in this particular instance, do I hate his guts? Also, yes. Also, yes. So, I mean, listen, hate him or not, the man did his job. It sucks. It sucks because OJ was right time, wrong guy, right? The Black community needed a win, especially against the LAPD. And there were so many other times that they could have gotten that. Rodney King, Latasha Harlins, Eula Love. The list goes on, but instead, it happened at a time when you had all the evidence in the world against somebody who actively, viciously, in my opinion, murdered two innocent people. And again, OJ, who turned his back on the Black community so many times before, now becomes this beacon of hope because the Black community is tired, and rightfully so. However, on the other hand, for the Brown family and the Goldman family, they are robbed of their loved ones. They are robbed of a fair trial, and it's just all very sad. 157 days into the trial, they go into closing arguments. And to sum it up, prosecution argues facts and evidence. O.J. Simpson was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to him as the killer of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. Marcia Clark emphasized the DNA evidence, including blood drops matching Simpson at the crime scene, the infamous bloody glove, and the timeline of events that placed him at the scene. The prosecution also pointed to Simpson's history of domestic violence, suggesting that Nicole's murder was the result of escalating abuse. Christopher Darden strongly defended the LAPD, arguing that there was no police conspiracy and that the evidence was legitimate. He told the jury that O.J. Simpson had the motive and the means and the opportunity to commit the murders, urging them to focus on the scientific facts rather than race or police misconduct claims. But the defense would focus on emotional impact. They focused on reasonable doubt and police corruption, particularly through Detective Mark Fuhrman, whose racist remarks on tape severely damaged his credibility, along with him lying on the stand. Johnny Cochran delivered one of the most famous lines in legal history: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." He told the jury, you have to police the police. You can stop the corruption by your verdict. You can make a change. You can stick it to the police. His closing statements had more about the impact that this verdict would have on the LAPD than really anything to do with OJ or Ronald or Nicole. He painted the LAPD as racist and corrupt, suggesting that they planted evidence, framed Simpson because of their bias. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was mishandled, the investigation was sloppy, and the police rushed to judgment. Cochran closed by reminding the jury that they had to be absolutely sure before convicting Simpson, saying, quote, reasonable doubt equals not guilty. And I just want to state right here that not guilty does not mean innocent. And the jury starts deliberations for a trial that took 244 days. And everyone was convinced that it was going to be at least a day, let alone weeks before they would get an answer. Carly Douglas says that you should expect the jury to take 1 day per week of the trial to deliberate. But the jury, to everyone's shock, would take less than 4 hours to deliberate. You have 12 people who don't know each other in a room, who have never been able to discuss this trial together until this moment. They are supposed to go over all the evidence, all the witness testimonies, and it took them less than 4 hours to come to a verdict. 8.5 months this trial went on. And we also have to remember that the jury was sequestered. They would go back to their hotel rooms. They couldn't speak to anybody. They couldn't speak to each other. Nothing for 8.5 months. So do I think that jury fatigue set in? Absolutely. They wanted to go home. But I don't think that that was the only reason some of these jurors voted the way that they did. Just like it started is exactly how it ended. Just a media circus outside of the courthouse, millions of people glued to their TV, watching, waiting. And the jury comes back and they state not guilty. And then at that moment, there's an even bigger racial divide. The Black community erupts into celebration because for the first time, and maybe forever, they're witnessing somebody from their community stick it to the man. And the white community fell silent, and they were not happy with this verdict. Darden goes on to say that some people thought OJ was innocent, some people truly believed that he was set up, and some people thought this was a way to pay back the LAPD. There's a juror from another documentary that I watched who said that this, in fact, was payback for Rodney King. Carl Douglas lays it out so eloquently here. He said when the Black community celebrated, they weren't celebrating OJ as a man or as a person. They were celebrating that for the first time, they got a win in a system that was built against them. And they saw it play out in real time. OJ goes home, he has a big party. But while they're all there, OJ, lawyers, friends, and so on, they turn on the TV and they see Robert Shapiro, OJ's original lawyer, sitting down with Barbara Walters saying that this case should have never been about race. And Robert is turning on everybody. And Mike Gilbert makes a great point in the documentary. And he says, when we were having a party at OJ's, nobody was thinking about Ron or Nicole. But I have to be honest about this. The whole trial, aside from their families, I don't think anybody was thinking about Ron or Nicole. And Robert Shapiro said, not only did we play the race card, but we played it from the bottom of the deck. And as OJ saw a not guilty verdict in the courtroom, he saw a very guilty verdict from those he had aligned himself with all these years before. And honestly, in a weird way, I think justice was served for OJ because he wanted to be known and be praised, and he wanted the fame, which he had, but now it was infamy. No one wanted him around. He was isolated. Everything that he adored was gone. And as the Goldman family didn't get the justice that they sought in the criminal trial, they would not give up on Ronald. And they filed a civil suit against O.J. Simpson in 1996. Unlike the criminal case, which required proof beyond reasonable doubt, the civil trial only required a preponderance of evidence, meaning the jury had to believe it was more likely than not that Simpson was responsible for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. This was insanely different than the criminal case. Different jury, different judge, no cameras, different witnesses, and OJ testifies, which I have to tell you, maybe we'll watch it in a live stream. It's one of the most uncomfortable things to watch. It made my skin crawl. And I have to tell you, Johnny Cochran knew exactly what he was doing by not letting OJ testify, because OJ wanted to testify. And in a lot of defense cases, your defendant won't. But in this case, he contradicted himself. He lied on occasion. He was combative. And in the end, he was unanimously found guilty for the wrongful deaths of Ron and Nicole. And Kim Goldman talks about what happens after. And she said it was just odd. OJ, who was just found liable, right, of murdering 2 people in a civil lawsuit, was able to just walk out the same door that they did. And he went and got himself some ice cream. And although OJ didn't go to prison, both the Brown family and the Goldman family got what they needed from a jury of their peers. They heard somebody in a court of law say that OJ was guilty. And they would be awarded $33.5 million, which Mike Gilbert calls a ridiculous amount of money. But I found that comment to be so gross, because when a loved one is taken from you in such a brutal attack, what's a sufficient amount of money? None. The answer is none. And nobody would ever see that money. OJ even told Mike Gilbert allegedly that I'm not paying it. But Kim said it wasn't about the money. She just said if I could make his life miserable in the meantime, quote, hell yeah. And I would love to buy this woman a coffee and just sit in her presence. Honestly. Mike Gilbert goes on to tell a story of OJ and him having a moment alone, and he asked him essentially what happened. And OJ had told Mike that if Nicole didn't open the door with a knife, she would still be alive. And Mike Gilbert quit as OJ's agent. And OJ then moves to Florida, where he starts living it up. You know, the white stuff, women, bars, strip clubs. He did a show where he was making fun of the Bronco and getting people to sit in it and essentially laughing at the whole situation, even saying, oh, hopefully there's no bodies in this thing. Just scum behavior. And I don't know how you can cry over Nicole or say that you ever loved her and then do something like this. I can't imagine being the families of Ron or Nicole and just watching this in real time. But OJ would find himself in trouble again. In 2007, OJ Simpson was involved in a robbery at a Las Vegas hotel, where he and a group of men stormed into a hotel room to take back sports memorabilia that he claimed had been stolen from him. They were armed with guns. The group confronted 2 sports memorabilia dealers and took various items. The incident was caught on audio recordings, which became key evidence in court, and Simpson argued that he was just retrieving his own property, but the prosecution saw it as armed robbery and kidnapping. In 2008, he was found guilty and sentenced to 33 years in prison. 33 seems to be a number here. $33.5 million, 33 years in prison. But after 9 years, he was eligible for parole and he was released in 2017. I find it very interesting that at his parole hearing, he said, "I've never been accused of pulling a weapon on anybody." What? And this is one of the reasons that I like watching different documentaries about the same thing. So they talked to Mike Gilbert about the memorabilia because his name was on the boxes and the dealers bought it from Mike, and OJ wanted it back. And in this documentary, Mike talks about how he was very separate from OJ, and OJ goes on to Florida and does his own thing. But in Made in America, as I recall, he was very much a part of selling the assets and being a part of that whole thing, and kind of watching OJ become this monster in real time because he was there. I got to be honest with you. I don't like the way that this is being told from Mike Gilbert at all. If you guys want me to do a breakdown on that documentary, I'd be happy to do it. It's a long one. I don't know how much OJ content you guys want to consume, but whatever, just let me know. But then they would flash to April of 2024, where they would announce that OJ has passed away. And they start doing the exit interviews, which is gut-wrenching. So sad. Christopher Darden talks about how race is no different between 1995 and 2025, and he's tainted with this for the rest of his life. And all he was trying to do was his job. They have an exit interview from Mark Fuhrman, but they flash text on screen that he was the only person convicted of a crime during the O.J. Simpson trial because he lied on the stand. And I just found that so interesting. Carl E. Douglas says that he thinks that the jury got it right and that he'll sleep soundly like he has for the past 30 years as far as his work concerning OJ. But I want to talk about that. One of the jurors came out and said that this was just payback for Rodney King, and she wanted to go home. She wouldn't answer if she thought OJ was guilty or not. There was a man that was reported to be a former Black Panther, and after the verdict was read, he stood up and put his fist in the air and almost saluted OJ Simpson. Did the jury need a feeling of justice inside their community? Absolutely. Did the jury get it right? It depends on which case they were there for. Because originally, this was the case of OJ Simpson murdering Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, which turned into a case against the LAPD, which morphed into a case against Mark Fuhrman, which turned into a case of race. Did they get it right in the lens of racial inequality? Did they get it right when trying to take a stand against the LAPD? Did they get it right in a case or trial against Mark Fuhrman? You cannot convince me that they got it right in a case against O.J. Simpson for 2 counts of first-degree murder. I struggle with my feelings on Mike Gilbert, but he says that a lot of people say O.J. destroyed your life. And he said, no, O.J. gave me the opportunity to destroy my own life, which I thought was very profound and self-aware. And as I've stated before, I think people can make changes. I think, in certain cases, reform can happen. I loved at the end of this, Christopher Darden says that the takeaway is domestic violence. And they showed Denise Brown, who is Nicole's sister, saying, "My sister will not die in vain." And she absolutely kept her promise. She is a domestic violence activist. She's worked tirelessly to raise awareness, support victims. She's taking something incredibly devastating and turning it into something very powerful to hopefully help other victims. Kim Goldman has done the same thing. She's dedicated her life to victims' rights, advocacy, and she tries to honor her brother's legacy by trying to help victims and their families. In her exit interview, she talks about why she does this. And it's because she says that we've sensationalized grief and trauma and all these things. And she wants to be able to teach people how to take these things in a loving and understanding and empathetic way. But as always, we leave with the reason in which we came, which is Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown. Nicole Brown Simpson was a bright, compassionate, and loving soul who left an unforgettable mark on everyone who knew her. She had an effortless warmth that made people feel welcomed, a vibrant spirit that lit up every room, and a deep love for her family, friends, and children. She cherished life's simple joys, fashion, photography, travel, and creating lasting memories with her loved ones. Nicole was more than just this story. She was a daughter, sister, mother, and friend whose kindness and grace continue to inspire. Her family honors her by ensuring her life is remembered for the love she gave, the strength she carried, and the joy she spread. Ron Goldman was a kind-hearted, ambitious, and selfless young man who made it his mission to help and uplift others. Ron approached life with passion, generosity, and infectious energy. He was someone who made people smile, support those in need, and lived with a sense of purpose. His memory is kept alive by those who loved him, ensuring that he is remembered not just for how his life ended, but for the kindness, laughter, and light he brought into the world. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available. I've included resources in the description box down below, and please don't hesitate to reach out. If you like what you saw here today, make sure to check out some of our other videos. Be kind to one another. My name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion.